Right, so it's a pleasure to moderate this fifth focus session entitled Cross Purposes, the Utility of the Mester de Clerecía, which is going to probably take a shift the focus from the texts themselves to the studies of this text, and it's going to take us on a journey, on a trip from the origins of the Mester de Clerecía studies to the relevance of studying the Mester de Clerecía today. We have three presenters who need no presentation, but I'm going to present them anyway so that you can enjoy my fine English. Our first presenter is Patricia Grieve, professor at Columbia University, whose work covers an enormous variety of aspects of Iberian literature and cultures, from sentimental romance to the foundational narrative of La Cava, the Eve of Spain. She has also published extensively in the Mester de Clerecía. I recall a couple of articles on the Libro de Apolonio and also the Milagros de Nuestra Señora. And today she's going to present a paper about the impulses behind the origins of Mester de Clerecía studies. 1865, Spain's nation formation project and intellectual currents around the birth of Mester de Clerecía studies. So please join me in welcoming Patricia Grieve.
Thank you, Pablo. And I also want to thank the organizers. It's really a beautiful conference. And I also want to thank the previous panel. It was really, really stimulating. And I know it's getting late in the day and people are really tired. So I'm going to stick to my 15 to 20 minutes. And if not, just get the hook and pull me off. And I will go. The other thing is years ago, when I was Alan Behrman's student, and when I was fretting about the fact that the paper I had written did not match the title of the talk I had proposed, he said, well, don't worry, just get up there and give your paper, and then say, the relationship of the title of the talk to the paper will be obvious to even the meanest intelligence. That's what I'm sticking to now. Africa begins at the Pyrenees. Variously attributed to Napoleon or Dumas père, it reflects a commonly held belief in 19th century Europe, a view vehemently rejected by most of the Spanish intellectuals of the time. And here's a quotation. It is an error of geography to have assigned Spain to Europe. It belongs to Africa. Blood, manners, the way of life, and making war. In Spain, everything is African. The two nations have been mixed up for too long. The Carthaginians who came from Africa to Spain, the Vandals who left Spain for Africa, the Moors who stayed in Spain for 700 years for such a long cohabitation, not to have confused the race and customs of the two countries. If the Spaniard were Mohammedan, he would be completely African. It is religion that has kept it in Europe. Now this was written by Dominique Dufour de Prat, who was a secretary to Napoleon and also the Abbé de Prat, an French ecclesiastic, and he wrote this in 1816. The mission of the conservative 19th century Spaniards was to deny the former, that Spaniards were Africans, and reaffirm completely the latter, that Spain in its history was thoroughly Catholic. Who is Spanish? Who may live in Spain? From the earliest Christian chronicles about the invasion of the peninsula by the North African Berbers, even to very recent writings about the problems of immigration, these deceptively simple questions appear implicitly and explicitly over and over, having inspired through the centuries enormously contested answers. The search for answers, based on the continuing search for origins, consumed academics and other intellectuals in the 19th and 20th centuries. And we all know about Manuel Milà Fontanals and 1865 in the inaugural address, and using the term Mester de Clerecía, and he did so at a time of intense nation formation in Spain. The works that most critics include as works of Mester de Clerecía are erudite, follow a particular time scheme, usually emphasize the Christian nature, and are mostly written in Castilian, which critics cite as important elements in the 19th century search for origins, in which Spain, among other European countries, was heavily invested. As we all know, in order to forge a Castilian nationalist history, regional identities and ethnic minorities not only fall by the wayside, but are given a mighty push. One thing that interested me as I was considering the timing of the 19th century, it's on, right? 19th century search for a Castilian Catholic, essentially Spanish national identity in the works of the medieval period was the status of Arabic and Jewish studies in Spain during the same period in the 19th century. The other point that interested me was the idea of Africa and Africanness as evidenced by the quotes above. As it turned out, I could not do both in an 8 to 10 page talk. So in the spirit of this gathering on specific CLERECÍA texts, I decided to focus on the second point. Given 19th century Spain's sensitivity to European allegations of Spain's Africanness, might we see as particularly appropriate for 19th century concerns Poema de Fernando González's retelling of the legend of the fall of Spain in the 8th century to the North African Berbers, the start of the Christian conquest beginning with Pelayo, and the references to Africa throughout the epic? Might we see it as particularly appropriate for the 19th century? In my book, The Eve of Spain, Myths of Origins and the History of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish Conflict, I examined in the final chapter the artistic manifestations of the stories of Rodrigo, La Cava, Julian, and Pelayo from the Enlightenment to the present, and in particular, their popularity in Spanish and English Romanticism in the heyday of Orientalism. As I discussed, Spaniards had a conflicted relationship with Orientalism, on the one hand basking in Europe's interest, as in French fairs that celebrated Andalusian festivals of Moros y Cristianos, or Marimé's Carmen, while chafing at the socio-political reductiveness that conflated flashily costumed Moors and Gypsies with all of Spain. I attempted to show how the myths of origins of Spain contributed to the national debate about the essence of Spain and Spanish national identity in the 19th and 20th centuries. Pelayo and his legendary achievements continued to be important, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. Not only was Pelayo intriguing to Spanish, English, and American authors of the 19th century, but his story became inextricably linked to the world of politics in Francisco Franco's dictatorship. While I did mention Poema de Fernando González in an earlier chapter of the book, it was with reference to the trope of the comforting Muslim women who I called sexually available Muslim princesses. I did not discuss the first 116 stanzas of Fernando González. At the time, I did not think that part of the poem, the defeat of the Visigothic kingdom under Rodrigo by the invading North African Berbers, and Pelayo's subsequent victory at the Battle of Covadonga, which legendarily launched the start of new Christian conquests, added anything to the conversation about literary evolutions of the story of the fall of Spain in 711. But now I think I was wrong. Before turning to PFG itself, let's consider a few influential chronicles that preceded it. We know that the introduction of the raped young woman, who came to be called La Cava, comes from Arabic sources. Our first extant witness of this reason for the invasion, Count Julian's pact with the Berbers to avenge the rape of his daughter, is the mid-9th century Egyptian Al-Hakim's history of the Berber and Arab victories in the peninsula. Two early Christian chronicles, the Crónica Mozárabe of 754 and the late 9th century Crónica de Alfonso III, both use the technique of providential narrative to tell the story. And in both cases, the cause of the invasion is the iniquity of King Rodrigo and his people, spurred on by the debauchery of Rodrigo's predecessor, Witiza, and his sons, which had infected the clergy and noblemen of the kingdom. In both cases, and in later Christian chronicles, the invasion is not a clash of Islam versus Christianity, but of God punishing his own people for their sins, as he does in the Bible, and which is known literarily as a decadence tradition. Their own decadence provoked the wrath of God and impelled their punishment. Crónica Mozárabe compares what befell Spain to biblical stories, and it never names the invaders as Muslim or as followers of Muhammad. Rather, the chronicler sticks with the geographical names of the various inhabitants of North Africa, Saracens, Berbers, Mauritanians, from which derived the word Moro. In this way, there can be no suggestion of the victory of Allah over the Christian God, but of people of one region over those of another, insisting, however, that this is part of a divine providential plan. Crónica de Alfonso III is modeled on Isidore of Seville's 7th century history of the Goths, in which he had praised Spain's qualities of being like paradise, and compared the glories of the Visigothic kingdom in the peninsula to that of the Greeks and Romans, a great stretch of the imagination by any measure. For its part, the Chronicle of Alfonso III has a biblical narrative in which the invaders are Chaldeans. This chronicle is the first lengthy description of Christian resistance in the north to Al-Andalus, inventing the story of Pelayo, legendarily elected king of the Asturias. The chronicle never mentions Count Julian, never mentions a sexual sin by King Rodrigo, never mentions a raped young woman. However, what it does invent is the story of the abduction of Pelayo's sister by one Munusa, which Pelayo then sets out to avenge, and he does so with the victory at Covadonga. Between 880 and 1118, Christian sources do not mention a daughter until the Chronicon Silense in 1118. The 13th century Liber Regum and Chronica Viarense do not mention the daughter of Julian and focus instead on the sons of Rodrigo's predecessor Witiza and the betrayal that is the doing of broken accords between men. In Fernando González, the daughter is not mentioned, though Julian does betray Rodrigo, convincing him to destroy the weapons in his realm in order to have peace with the people of Africa. Lucas de Tuy, in Chronicon Mundi of 1236, does include this episode of the destruction of the weapons. The influential Hispano-Latin history by Rodrigo Jiménez de Herrada, that was mentioned earlier, Bishop of Toledo, and known as El Toledano, continues the providential narrative of a decadence tradition that stems from the sons of Witiza. Jiménez de Herrada's history, with strong connections to the Chronicle of Alfonso III, does include the rape of Julian's daughter, which Chronicle of Alfonso III does not. While El Toledano affirms that Julian was angry when Rodrigo refused to marry his daughter, the overarching theme of the successful invasion of the peninsula remains God's wrath against the iniquity of his own people. El Toledano's work, composed about a decade before Fernando Félix and with a strong Castilian emphasis, praises Fernando Félix as a true hero set by God above other men. I am not suggesting a line of direct influences from the Mozarabic Chronicle of 754 or the Chronicle of Alfonso III to El Toledano and then to the author of Fernando Félix. Rather, I'm demonstrating that even once the legend of the violated daughter of Julian has entered Christian writings from its originally Arabic sources, the decadence tradition, the unrelenting issues of fractured governance in the Visigothic kingdom, and God's subsequent punishment and future rewarding of his people remains a powerful narrative tradition, even at the time of the composition of Fernando Félix. And it is within this tradition that the invaders of the Iberian Peninsula are people from North Africa, rather than followers of an Allah victorious over Christianity, that Fernando Félix, with slight modifications, composes its version of the fall of Spain in the 8th century and its subsequent triumphant rebounding with the victory of Pelayo at Covadonga. So in what ways do we see innovation on the part of the Fernando Félix author? I believe there is an interesting development and complex web of associations with how the enemies of Rodrigo and peninsular rulers to follow are described, and is related to the suggestion of various scholars that the poet seems to, if not exactly belie Goths and Spaniards with the future Castile and Castilians, then to create a web of associations that allows the reader to perceive the historical inheritance of the Visigothic kingdom by Fernando Félix and Castile. Like Fernando Félix's predecessors, Moros appears infrequently associated with Islam, and therefore more with their geographical location, and that they are the invading enemy. It would not be logical at this point in time to completely ignore the fact of Islam, and yet the poet chooses to play this aspect down whenever possible, in the service of emphasizing that the sins are those of the Visigoths, in spite of the fact that Rodrigo is referred to more than once as buen rey and a doer of bien, which you rarely see until 15th century, if you see it at all, and that punishment comes from their God rather than from an Islamic defeat of the peninsula. The poet cleverly introduces references to gentes de Africa, eliding the Moros with this broader term of the enemy. By representing Goths, Spaniards, and Castilians as interrelated, Rodrigo Escuentre, who faces an African enemy, this cleric's craft, I believe, anticipates evolutions to the legend of the fall of Spain that I had thought began more with Spanish Neo-Gallicism in the 15th century than earlier, when all and sundry sought to prove that their lineage descended from the Visigoths, and which were then developed more fully in the 16th and 17th centuries in terms of lineage and of the Africanness of the invaders. Although this last point is a huge topic. By way of example, I mean how Lope, for example, in Las Paces de los Reyes y Judía de Toledo, refers to the 8th century invaders as Africanos Bárbaros, and how William Rowley, writing in England in more or less the same time period, in a tragedy called All's Lost by Lust, has his King Rodrigo say to messengers, "You told us of a hot invasion, the barbarous and tawny Africans intend upon our confines," and then referring to them as swarty, sooty as the inhabitants of hell. In sum, then, Fernando Félix's emphasis on where people come from within a work that constructs the birth of a nation, Castile and its Castilians, seems somewhat modern to me, to anticipate the bloodline and lineage arguments that become an obsession in 15th century Spain and beyond. It will be clear to anyone here who's written on Fernando Félix or who has read the scholarship that there are points of intersection between what I'm examining and what has come before. First and foremost, the 1990 article by Alan Dermond on the biblical references in the first 116 or so stanzas, and the 2009 book chapter by Julian Weiss on the birth of a nation, feudal fictions in a poema de Fernando Félix. As Weiss says, that this epic promotes a nationalist agenda is accepted by all. Castile is the true inheritor of the Visigothic legacy, and as such leads the way in the fight against Islam. This reading, while broadly accurate, needs to be fleshed out by more detailed textual analysis and a wider frame of reference. For in the process of promoting Castilian hegemony, the poem reveals much more. Its representation of nationhood rests upon a particular and ultimately rather anxious vision of the political and economic organization of the feudal state and its relationship to violence. My small contribution to the fleshing out that Weiss calls for is to suggest that the obvious fight against Islam, the binary of Christianity versus Islam, is not so neatly presented as such in Poema de Fernando Félix, but rather is complicated by the poet's strategies to, at times, play down the fact of the Islamic enemy in order to first highlight the relationship between God and his Iberian Christians, and two, to begin to elide the Islamic enemy into the geographically located Moros, along with the assertion that they are Africanos or gentes de Africa. On the one hand, I think that my argument shores up those of both Dermond and Weiss, though admittedly Weiss's argument on the political and economic organization of the feudal state and its relationship to violence as a way of representing nationhood and its anxieties does not need much shoring up. On the other hand, I think that Dermond perhaps uses the word Islam and Islamic enemy in describing what happens in various stanzas that the text itself does not always bear out. For example, he refers over and over to the Muslims preparing for war before they cross the Straits of Gibraltar, Julian's invitation to the Muslims to cross the Straits of Gibraltar, and the Muslim conquest of Spain. While this is technically accurate, I maintain that Fernando Félix itself intentionally plays down references to the religion of the invaders. I think that the poem is not concerned with, as Weiss says, circumstances that make possible the victory of Islam, but rather the circumstances of dynastic dissension and Visigothic sins that impelled the plots of the Visigothic kingdom. In that regard, I'm not disagreeing with Weiss at all in terms of his conclusion, but rather I suggest that the use of Moros does more than pit Islam versus Christianity. It is true that the opening stanzas do indeed talk of this binary, and that the fall of Spain was by the mortal enemigo and done by Mahoma de la mala creencia. But in its fidelity to the decadence tradition, the poet manifests an interest in highlighting monarchical disputes over the idea of a religious war. Furthermore, by eliminating overt references to the rape of Julian's daughter and the abduction by Munusa of Pelayo's sister, Fernando Félix intentionally desexualizes the legend of the fall of Spain in order to maintain a focus on political causes and consequences and future political issues which Weiss has brilliantly shown. I would say then that both the desexualization of the narrative, as well as the reduced emphasis on the religion of the invaders, replaced by one on their Africanness, serve to underscore the truly political nature of the text, at the same time that it insists upon the ethnic otherness and geographically distant origins of the enemy. So to take a look at the text briefly, between stanzas 7 and 26, there are plenty of references to Spain, but none to Moros or Africa. In stanza 27, the narrator tells us that El Rey Sidnus was a natural lord over España y Africa, which we know is not historically correct. But it does speak to, if not imperial designs of the Visigoths, then at least a hope for a colonization of a place that was not Spain, but Africa. From stanzas 28 to 70, the Moros are mentioned only twice, and it is as political enemies, while evil mischief is sown in Spain by El Diablo Antiguo. In 71, Nunca en él andaba. Now it may be the case, as Dermond asserts, that the devil and Islam are associated and should be recognized as such here. But the very next stanza makes no mention of Islam or of Moros as Muslims, but of las gentes africanas. Cuando fueron las armas despechas y quemadas, fueron apuestas nuevas a Marruecos fachadas. Las gentes africanas fueron luego juntadas, al puerto de la mar fueron luego llegadas. Two stanzas later, religion enters again, this time by referring to the invaders as todos estos paganos que África mandaban contra los de Europa, despechosos estaban, llegaron a Sevilla, la gente renegada. In a move that would undoubtedly please 19th century Spaniards, the binary I'm sorry, my handwriting here. The binary in this stanza, in the paganos of Africa versus the people of Europe, not Spain. So establishing a binary between Africa and Europe, which of course 19th century Spain longed to be part of. While stanza 81, in the heat of battle, pits the Christians against the Moros, calling them also paganos, the point is nonetheless made that it is the Christian God who is in charge, at a moment when the Christians think they are winning. Fuéranse los paganos esas horas tornados, si non por quien non hayan perdón de sus pecados. Thus, what is borne out here is not that Islam will win, but that the Christian God will not permit the Moors to flee because it had been ordained and prophesied, as the text tells us, that the Christians were to pay for their sins in the impending loss. The poem continues then to make references to the sins of the Visigoths, to Moros, to pueblos descreídos, and then the suffering of Christianity. It is implicit that if the Christians are suffering and churches are desecrated and plundered by the victors, the winners are the Muslims. And I may be making too much of this, but there is no reference at all to Islam, to Muhammad, to their God. In short, it is described as a political triumph by the invaders in a way that any victory might be described. For reasons of time, I have to skip over Pelayo, but I don't think there's anything in that section of stanza 116 that contradicts the points I've made up to now. What I'd like to do next, if I continue to work on this as an article, is consider in depth the at least 9 other references to Africa that occur in the poem beginning with stanza 385. Simply put, the opposition is established between Castile and Africa. But I don't yet know if more can be made of the references to Africa, other than the way I think it's used in the legend of the fall of Spain. It may well be that the author of Fernán González intended by the number of references to Africa in the later parts of the poem to create a parallel between the history of Fernán González himself and Alfonso X's planned African crusade, as Peter Such and Richard Barbone suggest in their new edition of the poem. But I would like to explore more why, as Such and Barbone said, Al-Mansur and his followers are repeatedly associated with Africa, and that they are presented here as an essentially African foe. If we return to the opening quotation by Dutour de Prat, only religion separates the African from the Spaniard. They are the same ethnically or racially. But Fernán González introduces the notion, well before the 15th century, of Visigoths as Spaniards or Castilians, and the enemy as most definitively African, and in so doing, not only defines them as different peoples, but plays down the power of Islam. For the author of Fernán González, Africa most certainly did not begin in the Pyrenees. And if the 13th century political milieu can appropriate and manipulate the historical through 10th centuries, there's no reason why 19th century Spaniards could not see in the 13th century from Manuel Milà a firm rejection of the identification of Spain with Africa, Spaniards with Moors, or gentes africanas, a historical rebuttal to the sneering Europeans who dismissed Spain as backwards and other. I started with a quote, so I'll finish with one. For nearly 800 years, the Moors ruled Spain from its southern stronghold, El Andalus, ushering in a period of enlightenment and relative tolerance, while the rest of Europe thrashed about in the Dark Ages. In 1492, the Spaniards reconquered the nation, forcing Muslims to convert, persecuting them, and finally driving them back to where they came from, which was Africa. So, when and where might that have been written? Anybody? Sounds sort of like Duclos, but it is Lizette Alvarez writing in the New York Times in Madrid, March 15th, 2004. So, driving them back to where they came from. So it would appear that today we're rehearsing some of the same concerns of the 19th century as Spain continues to grapple with powerful political issues of multiple Iberias, to continue to try to project a single and singular Spanish national identity and culture, and to assert once again, as late as 2004, that Spaniards are not African, since the Africans were driven back in 1492 from whence they came. Thank you.